window of opportunity that would support public investment. This is Angel Gurria, the Secretary General of OECD, making this remark in 2016, not so that long ago, well, this time last year. And the thing is, when people are thinking about investment, they usually think public investment in infrastructure, they usually think about this sort of thing, bridges, road, and so on. And in some countries, improving water supply and so on is critically important. But they tend not to see investment in the social caring. They don't see that as an investment. And formally, it comes out of current expenditure rather than capital expenditure. And this means that in times of public debt, it's difficult to do. They can't envisage increasing their expenditure at that time. If one takes social care in this country, it's dreadful. There's been report year after year talking about horrific circumstances. It gets quite a bit of media attention for a moment and then drifts away. The King's Fund in 2016 saying a picture that emerges is of social care providers under pressure, struggling to maintain staff, maintain quality, stay in business, and so on. In this country, it's highly privatised, the social care. And this social care, in that sense, means care for the elderly, but we're thinking of it both care for the elderly and childcare. And in the UK, childcare is amongst the most expensive in Europe. But social care is in difficulty in many countries. The UNDP, for example, point out the growing need for social care, for investment, for facilities for older people, and that unless something is done about it, or unless there are some changes in the division of labour, it says women may find their choices to be increasingly constrained. So it's sort of structural imbalance that they're referring to there. So what we did was we looked at investing in the care economy, and we looked at 7 OECD countries to begin with. What we did specifically was to think about what would happen if you invested 2% of GDP in either the caring industries or in the construction industries. So you've got 2% of GDP to spend. You can spend it this way in the caring industries or that way in the construction industries. And the thing is, when you do investment, you create employment directly, you create jobs, but you also create jobs in other industries. So you have the direct... What did I do? All right. So you have the direct employment in the sector where you make the investment, but you also have indirect effects, because if you think about it, if you decide to build a bridge, you have bricks and mortar. And if you decide to invest in caring, again, you've got to construct facilities, but you also need people to run them, just as you need building workers to build the bridges or whatever. And all the investment, even the investment in the building workers, counts as investment in that sector. But in the care sector, the building would count as a physical infrastructure, but the running of it would count as an expenditure, and as I said, seen as problematic. But anyway, you create employment directly, you create additional employment through the related sectors, and then because people are working, they've got money, so they spend it in other sectors. So you get these multiplier effects, these knock-on effects from the original investment into a whole range of spheres. And what we find then is if you do that investment of 2% of GDP, then you create, if you do it in the caring industries rather than construction, so you put your money in, I mean, we think we should do both, but if you do put it in caring rather than in the construction, you create more jobs overall, more jobs for women. And the interesting thing is you create almost as many jobs for men as if you'd invested in construction, because of the knock-on effects in the indirect and induced investment. So it's a sort of win-win situation. And also you've got the intrinsic benefits from that investment. So you'd have better nurtured children and so on. And I have a table here which demonstrates the scale of these effects. It's actually a huge number of jobs if you invest in these things. I mean, obviously it depends on size of country, so not so many in Denmark in absolute terms. But if you think about if you just compare the rise in the headcount employment rate, this would be Australia, so a 0.5% in employment in construction, but a 2.3% if you invested in care. So you create more jobs overall if you do that investment, and it will contribute to gender equality because more of those jobs will be for women. You can see it slightly better in this diagram, where the yellow are men and the blue are women. You know, there are variations between countries depending on the composition of the sector and so on. And so, you know, that you can show that you will create employment. There's a slightly, using a slightly different technique, you can show it adds to economic growth. And the other thing is it will pay for itself over time, or partially pay for itself over time because of the increased taxes and reduced social benefits that you would otherwise might have to pay to people who were unemployed. So it's a win-win situation, but it's not considered. And you might argue, why isn't it considered? I mean, Diane was saying earlier that health and education are considered, but not so much social care or childcare when one's thinking about investment. How am I doing for time?
You're doing fine.
Right, so
5 minutes?
5 minutes, yes. So we were also asked by UN Women to look at less affluent countries. I mean, none of us who are doing the study have ever worked, or I might be misjudging my colleagues, but I don't think we've ever worked elsewhere or done serious work elsewhere. So we were somewhat reluctant to do this because of all the kind of, I don't know, some issues around knowing about context and everything clearly matter. But anyway, we were raising funds for the Women's Budget Group, so it was also because people work, you know, pro bono, as it were. So we did it anyway, for better or worse. And what we had to do, the data on social care, childcare, wasn't usable, really. So we looked at health and construction in 6 countries I think we ended up calling them emerging economies rather than in the global south, but they were in the global south as it happens, geographically. And again, we found that there were substantial increases in employment that occurred. In India and South Africa, we found that more jobs would be created if the investment was in construction, whereas across the other countries, we found that the opposite was the case. And more jobs across all countries would go to women if the investment took place in health and care, but except for Brazil and China, where just over 50% of the jobs would go to women, the majority of jobs would go to men. So it's sort of not the kind of finding that they really wanted, I think. so it got a bit less publicity. So, you know, the difference, I think, rests largely, well, you know, the particular context matters a lot. It rests largely on the data with the use of healthcare, which is more mixed by gender, and also all the kind of issues that would be raised by the informal sector being so prevalent in some of the economies, which makes, I mean, a lot of social care is done informally, as I understand things. But nevertheless, we found that the differential effects and investment in health is definitely a good thing to do for intrinsic reasons. So thinking about what's stopping us going forward, and this is a very modest contribution suggesting 2 elements out of the whole range of things that could possibly be important. We think that it's very important to recognise social investment in social infrastructure as an investment and something that should be done in the interests of economic growth. You know, there's an instrumental case for doing it, but of course there's also a very important intrinsic case in terms of enhancing social justice and gender equality. And then just coming out of the other study, I suggest quotas as a short-term fix. so that women have greater representation in positions of power. I don't think presence necessarily leads to change, but I think this build-up probably does. It's, so I say it's not a revolutionary or a holistic solution, but potentially steps on a transformative path, just to kind of, and then what is required. And I thought it's very interesting. I don't know if other people have looked at it yet, but the recent UNCTAD report 2017, which I've just started looking at, I mean, it's really quite radical in terms of some of the language and in some terms of some of the concepts that they have. They point out that the Sustainable Development Goals are okay, but they're talking about this new narrative of development or change that's required, and they suggest a new global deal, or a global New Deal. I may have got that out of order. Diane, which way round is it? Global New Deal?
I think it's a global New Deal.
Yeah, okay. Global New Deal. Yeah, so it's sort of Roosevelt, but in a global context. And I think working towards that narrative of change is really important. And I think the work that the Women's Budget Group did, that Diane referred to in this social infrastructure study, are small steps on the way to greater change, hopefully. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That 2% figure, and in particular the figure that jumped out at me was the 300,000 jobs in construction, but 750,000 in care services, care industries. Given the last election turned on the issue of care provision in the future, it seems a very explosive statistic, and I hope it's one that will be widely disseminated because it has huge potential impact.
I wanted to ask Dan, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things when you talk about automation being the great threat to jobs into the future, you know, there can be some jobs that robots are not going to be able to do, and in the care area, that's certainly going to be true. But one of the